this computer.
This meeting is being recorded.
There we are. Okay. So. Need to tuck that out of the way. There we go. Well, welcome. And we're going to begin with a short prayer and then a bit of an introduction as to how I hope this is going to go. So let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for your presence with us, for being with us to explore this United Church of ours. We ask for your grace and peace to have a spirit of learning tonight and through the number of weeks to follow. Help us in our questions. Give us a sense to ask whatever comes to mind, to not be afraid to ask. And be with us, we pray, this day and always in Christ's name. Amen. All right, well, welcome. And I had been kind of struggling with a title. Oh, and here comes Beryl, so we're good. So I had been struggling somewhat with a title of what to call this, and but in essence, it emerged out of a request from one of our previous sessions to have a night or several nights of effectively doing almost like a refresher, a confirmation refresher, because some said that they had actually never, they're members of the church, but they'd never actually gone through confirmation, which, explaining the circumstances, it seemed to make sense why, but thought that actually makes for a great subject for a session, and thought, but what to call it, and I had a couple of options. I'm going to give you some of the titles. Ultimately, I settled on everything that you wanted to know about the United Church, but were afraid to ask. And mostly that falls under my overall broad idea that when it comes to these types of seminars, there's no such thing as a stupid question, and there's never a bad time to ask it. And this is a chance to ask a number of those questions. I mean, I have a slated program tonight, like a process, only insofar as I start from what I know, and given that my first degree is primarily history, you're going to get a history lesson tonight, but I hopefully sort of pointing towards how we got here. And it's going to seem like a whirlwind, and it's the reason that I've got the globe behind me, aside from the fact that I like it, is that this is also orbital view kind of thing, and then we'll get into specifics as we move through. But one of the things that I also want to do is towards the end of tonight is I would like to actually write down a number of the questions that you have. I mean, if you want me to, if you have a question at any time, like stick up your hand and ask it. And this can also help shape the form of this as we move forward, because I've got a rough outline as to what we're doing. So the rough outline that we have, I've currently set it up for 4 sessions. This is a 4-session open-ended that will be on most Tuesday nights. So of course we have tonight, is just asking the question, where do we come from? Realizing that the United Church of Canada is less than 100 years old. Now, in 2 years, it celebrates its 100th anniversary. Next year, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Act of Parliament that made the formation of the United Church of Canada possible, which I'll get into. Which, given that over the 2,000 plus year history of the church, that doesn't seem like a lot. And so the question is, how did we get here, and why did we get here kind of the way that we are? Also, and then sort of following on to that is what we believe. Now, next week, a week from tonight, is Halloween. We're not doing this on Halloween, mostly because even if I were to stay home, the doorbell would be going ding, 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 and probably a number of you that might be the case. So what I'm going to be doing is we're going to do it Monday next week. Then the week after that, I'm on study leave for a week. So we then resume November 14th. That talks about governance and decision making. Now, keep in mind, this is an approximate line. This is not cast in stone, because some of the questions that you asked may actually help shape that. And then, among other things, then the question, the week 4 is where we go from here. Now, as I said, this can be stretched out. We do have room to do more sessions. But I thought this is a good starting point, and then as we go through, I mean, I can certainly add more material as we go. So, but one of the things that I wanted to start with was just an acknowledgement. One of my early titles for this was going to be called "This United Church of Ours" by Ralph Milton. Ralph Milton is a well-respected lay author within the United Church of Canada. He lives, I believe, in Vernon, and I've had some correspondence with him directly. In fact, he recently released a book called Well Aged, and was looking at doing a video series on it, but unfortunately and ironically, due to life circumstances, he's and aging, isn't able to deliver the way that he had hoped. And even though a couple of us, including myself, approached him to do something on this, he's had to step back. But one of his most famous works and well-loved ones is this particular book called "This United Church of Ours." It's been revised several times. It was originally published in the late 90s, and a part of a series that came up from Woodlake Books that described, so there's one called "This Anglican Church of Ours," "This Presbyterian Church of Ours," and "This United Church of Ours." And each of them are written by an author within that denomination to describe a bit of the history and that sense of identity. So now I'm not using this as a formal book study, but this is our textbook in that sense, that it may. So this is something, if you go to Woodlake Books, if you want the link, just let me know and I'll give it to you. I actually have sitting in the background this book in digital form only, because Woodlake Books no longer publishes physical books, but this book is available as a digital download that you can read. The only caveat that I would say was it was published in 1917, and ironically, a year later, the United Church of Canada changed its governance. So any questions about how its governance is already out of date. And so that's one of the things that we'll be dealing with, of what our governance was and what our governance is in a few sessions. So that's where that part comes in. So any questions before we get started?
Yes.
Richard.
When you go back to the very first page that you had up with the United Church symbol on it. Yep. Foster, a couple of weeks ago, actually used it for the kids' hour, but I found myself more of one of the kids because I really did not understand it completely.
Okay. Well,
so
I would be delighted to do a section on the symbol.
Because Foster did a sort of overview, but I left thinking, okay, I'm not sure of the overall symbolisms that were actually on the actual thing itself. I understood the dove, the Alpha and Omega. Yeah. But when it came to the burning bush and the book, somebody was talking to me while I was trying to be one of the kids and figure out what Foster was trying to say.
Not a problem. In fact, it actually fits very well for next week.
Okay.
That
So you're gonna make a comeback, is what you're telling me.
Yep. So no, quite seriously, because it fits into what we believe. It also does show a certain degree of identity, but mostly like it best fits into next week, because that symbol has been revised at least once, probably a couple of times since the inception of the United Church of Canada. So I can kind of go with like with the United Church, and just how the symbol, why the shape and everything else. Would love to do it, because it's absolutely rife with symbolism, and
Okay.
very
That's
happy.
what I'm after.
So that's the next week, Richard.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, oh,
Yeah.
no, don't apologize, please. That's like again, no such thing as a bad question, and never a bad time to ask it. So the short, when it comes to where did we come from, and the short answer is the United Church of Canada was formed in 1925 as a union between Presbyterian, Methodist, and Congregationalist churches in Canada. And it was formed by an act of Parliament, which I will get to it. It is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, and it still is. Now, those numbers may not look great, but at its peak in 1964, there were 1.1 million formal baptized members, approximately 6% of the population of Canada at the time. That's what it was peak. That's when it actually hit its peak. And a lot of that had to do with the baby boom. But that's in terms of that. Today, or at least in 2021, that number is 388,363 formal baptized members. And that works out to about 1.1% of the population of Canada. And you think, well, that's a considerable drop, which it is. But here's something else that's interesting. In the last census, in the 2021 census, approximately 1.2 million people identify as being part of the United Church of Canada. They identify as Christian, and specifically as part of the United Church of Canada. That's about 3% of the population. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church's representation in Canada is certainly larger. But when it comes to an individual denomination, it is about 3%. We can start splitting up these percentages in terms of this, but it's interesting that the church self-identifies less than 400,000 people as being part of our denomination. And yet in Canada itself, the wider population, 1.2 million people consider themselves to be part of the United Church of Canada. Richard.
Okay, now is that because of its philosophy? That more people are more accepting of so much more stuff, whereas they may not class themselves as religious versus those that are like myself, who was Catholic, who no longer embrace that specific institution. There we go. I'm trying to find the right word.
Yeah.
In order to go, oh, this is where my mind and how I believe God would want me to be versus that specific aspect.
Yeah, and that is entirely possible. I mean, one of the things that like we haven't inherited a membership system that functionally no longer works. But it's kind of what we've inherited as people in terms of what does formal membership look like, and that kind of thing. And oddly enough, for among other things, taxation reasons and things like that, we have to kind of self-identify as members. Whereas on a census, people can just simply write down what they feel is. So some may be historically United Church, some may be that they attend. Like Richard, for yourself, in a very strict way, you are not a formal member of the United Church of Canada, but as far as we're concerned, you are. So I think that the proper term that we use there is as an adherent, because you've not actually taken out membership in Trinity United Church, as far as I can tell. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so this is just an interesting statistic that even though, and it is very true that all major denominations in Canada have seen a decline. Doesn't matter which denomination it is, and it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. It's all gone. It's all slid down. But we may be in the middle of a historical cycle, but we'll see how this flows. Now, I wanted to show this cartoon because tonight is gonna feel like this cartoon. It's not my intention, but it might feel this way. Because it's kind of figuring out where on that tree we fit. Now, I would hope we say that Jesus is so lucky to have us. I would hope that that's not part of it. Like, for me, what I'm trying to do tonight is describe what is and where, how that thread gets to where we are today. So we go from Jesus to us. And trying to get us there. But I always bring this up we need to add a certain amount of humility, which is clearly not present in this particular in the upshot of this cartoon. But I'm still, the question of where we come from. And so the more complicated answer right here is that it was really the culmination of negotiations and a movement towards a more cooperative mindset after centuries of fragmentation among Christians, especially after the rise of the Protestant Reformation. But the Protestant Reformation was not the first time that it happened. And that's part of describing tonight, is to see this in the broadest possible context. And so we're going to do a little bit of church history, but like I said, this is like orbital view here for what we're doing. So we're gonna go all the way back. So and here we go. So, and when I say all the way back, we're going all the way back to the early church. The reason that I put 33 there is that's the approximate date of the crucifixion of Jesus. It's not exact. There's any number of reasons as to why to put it there. But even then, in the earliest part of the early church was actually just simply a movement inside Judaism that, thanks to the Jewish-Roman War, eventually began to emerge as a different faith tradition. And so it had its own struggles, struggles with identity and belief. During this time, this is the formation of the New Testament. It is also sees the rise of competing religious movements, including one that nearly killed it in the cradle. That's Gnosticism. But also in that time, Christianity, because thanks in many respects to both Roman roads and the Jewish diaspora, was able to spread through existing communities quite well. And in that time, those early centers that it developed around, that there were, Christianity sort of found five points, like five city. When I say centers, I'm using cities as description points, and in that, these ones are Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, and Ephesus, in no particular order. And one of the things that throughout being part of a Protestant tradition, mostly you just think Roman Catholic and Protestant. And it's much more complex than that. But these churches centers, is this when the Christianity first got started, it wasn't one place that was sort of central. There were 5 different places, and all developed and responded to their local circumstances. And what happened in 312 with the rise of Emperor Constantine is that Christianity went from being a persecuted minority to at least an accepted faith community within the Roman Empire. And Emperor Constantine, the Roman emperor at the time, moved because he himself was Greek speaking. Centered the seat of Roman authority not in Rome, even though it's still the Roman Empire, but was seated out of Constantinople, which is now modern day Istanbul. Great song about that, by the way. But Christianity gets legalized, and then the center of thought around Christianity moves from Ephesus, where Paul did a lot of his writing from, to Constantinople. And in that context, Christianity now has those fetters lifted off of it, and it begins to grow in a not insignificant political power as well. Also, as a reminder, prior to 312, dedicated Christian church buildings did not exist. Okay, so quite often we think of church as in, and then that equates to a building. Prior to 312, that when you talked about church, you talked about the people, not about a building ever. And so these dedicated buildings started to become legal to build, and then they started, so they started having dedicated worship spaces starting to show up, and Christianity continued to grow. But also, these 5 different centers. One of the things that as early Christianity developed, it also had a number of different ideas, and you'd have different groups, like, for example, Marcion, who tried to do his own thing, was declared, you know what, he's kind of out of the, he doesn't fit in there, because his ideas were to reject Judaism altogether, and that, in fact, if you really followed his theology, it's no longer monotheistic, etc. And there needed to be a consensus on the nature of Jesus, as well as, what do we believe? And so we have the development of a council that Constantine called, and these were called ecumenical councils. In other words, the community councils of the different churches represented by the different centers. Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. And they came together and would have conversations and try and develop a consensus. And so in this case, at the Council of Nicaea, even though it came in and there were some disagreements, what they came up with there was overwhelmingly accepted at the Council of Nicaea. I think it was in terms of the final vote, it was several hundred to 2. And the statement of faith that emerges out of this is something called the Nicene Creed, which, if there is one creedal statement that is universal in Christianity, it's this one. And it is present. It's present in Voices United. You can look it up. I've actually created a video on it, and it is a fairly sustained. It's not as short as the Apostles' Creed, which actually, ironically, despite its name, came later. But if there was sort of a litmus test in terms of belief within Christianity, it's the Nicene Creed. It ended up being refined a little bit over the next 60 years, but essentially this was it. And so the Nicene Creed, if you're looking for that so-called litmus test. The question is, do they adhere to this? And if the answer is yes, then you can consider them to be Christian in terms of the tradition, in terms of the broad sense. Now, there are a good number of denominations, especially today, that say everybody else is a heretic, but they don't accept the Nicene Creed, which is kind of, okay, well, what does that say? But I'm just going to kind of let that out there. Now, here's the other couple of things. Inside the Nicene Creed, there is this line, is we believe in the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now, keep in mind, the Roman Catholic Church, as we know it today, did not exist at this time in terms of what it evolved into. And so when it's saying Holy Catholic, Catholic is from Greek Katholikos, which means universal, all-encompassing, okay? And then apostolic means commissioned, or it's authentic commissioning is really what it means. So it's, in fact, the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, I suppose, means the sacred, universal, authentic gathering of the community is like, because church comes from the word ecclesia, and so it doesn't mean building; it means the gathered assembly. So that a little bit of trivia for you. But here's the thing: in 380, even when it was still a minority religion within the Roman Empire, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. And that does not change. It becomes established as the official religion of the Roman Empire at that point, and that does not change. And that has huge implications. So then we move into the rise of the imperial church. Now, at this point in time, the church basically operates inside of the Roman Empire. There may be some things sort of on the outer fringes, but it's within that. And so what we have is effectively what we call the rise of the imperial church. In other words, official state church also benefits from being a state church with, and then larger buildings get built. Their taxes can be actually used to build these structures now, rather than the Roman temples, the Roman or Greek temples. Now they're being applied to building dedicated church worshiping spaces. And through this point, Constantinople remains as the center point for the Roman Empire. At this point, all 5 church centers are still functional. 4 of them are Greek speaking, but 1 of them is Latin speaking. And I have a map coming up in a little bit. We think of the dominant language of the Roman Empire being Latin, whereas in fact it was actually, for more than half of it, was actually Greek. And that's probably one of the reasons why Constantine, never mind the fact that he was Greek speaking himself, moved his seat of power was in a place where people could understand it. And so between the 325 and 431, there were a total of 3 ecumenical councils, and they were coming together on various aspects of Christian understanding, looking for consensus, talked about the nature of God, the nature of Christ, the Holy Spirit, and they were all about refining understanding and trying to come to grips with different nuances in language, because the way something is phrased in Latin, for example, would be different than it is in Greek, would be different than it is in local language such as Coptic. And but unfortunately, because of that, eventually because we have a tendency to kind of grab something and run with it in our own directions and in our own linguistic understandings, that consensus would come to an end. But eventually you can see here, anywhere in red here is where Latin was dominant. And then anywhere in blue is where Greek was dominant, or the Greek influence. So Constantinople is right here. Antioch is here. Jerusalem here, although the Romans did destroy Jerusalem, but there is still it was still a center of thought in what was in what eventually Jerusalem eventually became, and Alexandria is here. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 centers, and then Rome is over here all by itself. And so you have this, the majority of Christians are in the eastern part of the empire. This actually gives a little bit better as to what sort of territories each of those Christian centers they were effectively in charge of. And so you have here, this is the Alexandrian center. Jerusalem is this one. Then you have Antioch, this region, and then the green here is Constantinople, and then the area is pink. It really is more towards the Italian peninsula and the like. Those centers are important to remember because they're the one thing historically we've lost along the way. But then along comes the Council of Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon, after they basically, these ecumenical councils would crop up every 50 years or so to work through some ideas, and then at this point there is an actual genuine split between, and it came over trying to understand the nature of Jesus being fully human and fully divine, and the question, or was Jesus effectively, was that divine essence completely embodied in Jesus, and how human was Jesus really? And due to a mistranslation and a misunderstanding, one of those centers, the Alexandrian center, and the churches sort of under its influence, they couldn't agree to the Council of Chalcedon, and they couldn't agree with it, and so this was the first time. And then so effectively there wasn't like this hard, they like burning heretics didn't come till the Middle Ages, so like but there ended up being this functional split. And the Oriental Orthodox Church had largely moved into everything was about the local languages, and Coptic was the dominant language in this area, and so this was the first. So you think of all this. This was actually the first split within Christianity between two different branches. So you start to have another branch forming. And so the bulk of the church, now four centers plus the Alexandrian center. Now the thing is, all of them still accept the Nicene Creed, but they disagreed on some of the nuances with that. Time moves forward. About 25 years later, all of a sudden, the fall of Rome. And we think of the fall of Rome, okay, that's when the Roman Empire ended, and that's actually not true. The Roman Empire didn't fall until 1453. I'll get into that in a second. But of course, as the church is doing its thing, so is the world. The history is clicking along. And you have this movement of the various Gothic tribes creating turmoil in Western Europe. And from what we understand, these Germanic tribes started moving through Europe, most likely because they were displaced by Attila the Hun, and those movements. And so there was a lot of movement of tribes through, but it did create conflict and political turmoil. And in 476, the Ostrogoths, the political structure, effectively the Roman bureaucracy crumbled. There had been raids. Rome had been sacked by Alaric in 410. But really, what marked the end of the Western Roman Empire is this part, is that when Rome fell, it ceased to be it's an independent political entity of its own. I mean, the reality is the Roman Empire, even though it encompassed all of this, was just too big to govern. And so that's why they had two different governing seats, one in Constantinople and one in Rome. But when Rome fell, what ended up happening is that all of that bureaucracy, that ability to govern, collapsed. But the Roman Church, I'm not even the Roman Church remained, because even though the Ostrogoths and the Gothic tribes were coming in, a lot of them had converted to Christianity, and so they actually left the church alone. And so the reality is the Roman Empire itself, self-identified Roman Empire, would exist until 1453, out of Constantinople, until finally the Ottoman Turks basically wiped it out. Historians use the term the Byzantine Empire to describe basically this Eastern Roman Empire until its final dissolution. But really, anybody in the Byzantine Empire would self-identify themselves as part of the continuing Roman Empire. And Justinian, the emperor, in 555, managed to regain a certain amount of political control over northern Italy and certain sections. But the reality is that the control that the Roman Empire had in the West was gone. And so what this eventually meant is that the center of Christianity in Rome became increasingly isolated from the various centers in Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. And the other thing is, and this is a very important distinction, is that the Christianity existed at the pleasure of the emperor, especially in the East. I mean, up until this point, Christianity was basically existed because the ecumenical councils were all called by the Roman emperor. But when you had the political structure falling in 476, all of a sudden the Roman Church was much more independent. And in fact, because they were largely left alone, they found certain things like there were bishops who actually suddenly found themselves with armies, for example. And initially they didn't know what to do with it, and then they started kind of going, actually, we kind of like this power here. And so with the collapse of these political systems, the Roman Church was the largest intact institution in the Latin-speaking world. And so the saying, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, when it came to political power, the Roman Church effectively not so much stepped into it willingly, but was drawn into that power vacuum. And so all of a sudden, now you had the Western Church starting to gain political power and influence, and then would try, because they kind of got used to it and kind of liked it, then they started trying to exercise that on the remaining centers of Christianity, eventually, because the Roman Church had always regarded itself as the first among equals, and I think it was just an inferiority complex to a certain degree because they spoke Latin and everybody else spoke Greek. But that language barrier between Latin and Greek would also play a hindrance. Now, I need to say, I am glossing over a whole lot of history here, but I'm just trying to get the overall trends in place. And this continued. Largely, we refer to anything after about 476 on through to at least the 11th century the so-called Dark Ages. Now, it really wasn't. There was a lot going on, but literacy fell, the communications fell, but there was a lot going on as far as the church was concerned in terms of gaining that kind of power and authority, and I'll get that. But during this time also, we had the rise and spread of Islam, and it surprised everybody. I mean, like just from out of nowhere, out of the Arabian Peninsula, all of a sudden there's this movement of, this described as an avalanche of humanity coming out of the Arabian peninsulas into what had developed as a power vacuum, because at the time, right around the beginning of the seventh century, the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire were, Sassanid being modern day Persia, and of course the Byzantine they were struggling over territory, but they had more or less worn themselves out against each other, and into this vacuum steps the Muhammad, and then eventually Muhammad's successors, and they just rapidly expanded into this power vacuum. And they just were not able, and it caught them all by surprise. And so what happened is, in the rise of Islam, all of a sudden Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch all fall under the influence of specifically the Rashidun and the Umayyad caliphates. I'll have a map up in a second. Now, in this time, Christians, for the most part, actually negotiate like the surrender of Jerusalem to the Arab armies was actually the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who negotiated the terms, who negotiated safety for both Christians and Jews living in these territories. And because Christians and Jews especially were people of the book, they were afforded that. They just had to pay a tax. But over time, this, of course, toleration would eventually fade. But you can see here this map that you can see Arabia, that over a period of approximately 10 years, Muhammad united the entire Arabian Peninsula, and then after his death, the Rashidun Caliphate expanded this way, taking over what was the Sassanid Empire here, as well as occupying a good chunk of like this territory here was all territory that the Byzantine Empire controlled, and then of course, and then it just continued to spread out there, and that became the extent of it. But I mean, as you can see, it happened over a period of 130 years, very, very rapid expansion. But what that did effectively for Christianity is it left two centers of Christian thought now, because even though Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria were left to continue to operate, they were now politically and communication-wise isolated from Constantinople and Rome. And so this set, unfortunately, the two remaining centers on a collision course with each other. And so what happened was the Western Church sees its own political influence grow, even though the different Western kingdoms were all fighting with each other. They were the only ones that seemed to have a modicum of kind of controls, so they were often doing diplomatic missions and that kind of thing. And the Latin Church managed to grow with this, whereas the Eastern Church was still operating at the pleasure of the Byzantine Emperor. And so even though it had political influence, it didn't have the kind of overt political influence in as the Roman Church did. And this particularly came into play. And this part you may be familiar with is that the Roman Catholic Pope crowned Charlemagne as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically what is now modern day Germany down into the Italian states. Which, of course, the Byzantine emperor, because they viewed themselves as the Roman Empire, they didn't take too kindly to. But the real upshot was of this is that from here on in, the Roman Catholic Church claimed to have the sole authority to crown monarchs in Europe. That they said, that is our job now. We get to do that. So in other words, if you have a claim to be king, unless you have us actually doing that ceremony, it doesn't count. You do not have legitimacy. So effectively, and that allowed the Roman Church to exert a considerable amount of political influence over all of the different nation states in Western Europe. And so in the West, you have the Roman Church claiming authority over the rulers. And in the East, it basically the Eastern Church existed as long as they didn't get on the bad side of either either the caliphs or the Byzantine emperor, they were okay, but there was still that they didn't have that kind of influence. And of course, the Byzantine emperor was not willing to play the game of letting Rome officially crown everything. So you started to have these tensions building up. And sorry, I accidentally went back, so I'm going to just bring this back up. But it all came to a head in approximately the middle of the 11th century. And this is the next big split. So we had the first split in 451, and then this is the next big split here 600 years later. And as the two remaining centers grow apart, it comes to a head in 1054. There are, in southern Italy, a good number of Greek-speaking churches that are under the authority of the Byzantine Empire. And however, the church in Rome decided, you know what? No, you need to do the Latin Rite, and we're going to enforce that. And began to enforce that. That created some tensions, because there were, of course, Latin-speaking churches in the Byzantine, and they started saying, no, okay, well then, if that's the case, then these guys, it became this tit for tat, Greek for Latin. And then the Roman Church attempts to exert more control over the Byzantine Church, which does not go over very well. And unfortunately, the personalities involved really didn't help either. And so you had these diplomats coming, and initially, the diplomats suddenly get mad and excommunicate each other. And then the patriarch and the pope effectively excommunicate each other. And you have the Great Schism, the split happens, and to this day, what we now call the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic Church are now two entirely separate entities. And so the Roman Catholic Church has effective control of the West, and the Eastern Orthodox churches in the East, plus, of course, the various other the Oriental Orthodox churches and those in the various areas in through the Middle East. But it gets worse, because not more than 40 years later, we have this overall period we refer to as the High Middle Ages, and we're taking this up to the Reformation. But one of the major things that happens over the next, especially 300 years, is the Crusades. And there were attempts to reconcile the churches, but curiously enough, in the aftermath, like one of the things that was also starting to happen is in the Middle East and around Jerusalem, the toleration for Christians and Jews started to drop, and there was some concern over that. But in addition to that, the Seljuk Turks started encroaching more and more on the Byzantine Empire's ever dwindling territory, and they wanted military support to fend off the Turks, and the Byzantine emperor at the time, at one point, had actually seen Norman knights in action and thought, I could probably use a few of those guys down here. So he sends a message to Rome and saying, could you maybe send a couple bands of those mercenaries, maybe help us keep the Turks at bay. But what grew out from that is that the Pope, of course, thought, hey, this might be a way to reunify the Eastern and Western Church, or for us to exert influence over that. This, through a series of interesting, that's not the right word, through a series, this turned into the First Crusade, and then all the subsequent crusades to follow. And because they couldn't get the West, like what was happening in the Western Empire is the Pope was looking at everything that's going on in the West, and they're all fighting with each other. They're like they're just a titch above a barbarians. They're all like fighting, jousting, and the feudal system was just a very warlike system. And to unify them, he says, okay, well, I'd like to honor that request, but how do I get them to go? And then let's go to Jerusalem, which is like miles, like thousands of miles past where they were asked to come and help. But surprise, surprise, due to weakness amongst the Seljuk Turks and the others, the crusade ends up being remarkably successful, and then the Roman Church starts exerting its influence in the East, much to the chagrin of the Eastern Orthodox Church. But what you see is the Roman Church is getting more and more and more powerful. And so you have this excise control, and in certain times, that level of control that the Roman Church had was almost totalitarian. And of course we hear, okay, it's the Crusades. We also hear the Inquisitions, and all that really nasty stuff happening through that. Dissent is actively suppressed, and all through this time. But of course, the Renaissance begins to change that as people, and through that, different inventions. And of course, the critical thing, at least as far as this is concerned, is the invention of the printing press in 1440. Now, of course, the history of the printing press has its own history, but really the arrival of the Gutenberg press, and then all of a sudden printing press machines start showing up, and all of a sudden the amount of literature available to people, and the first book being actively published is the Bible, and people start reading it for themselves. Literacy starts to go up, and then out of that, there's like ahead of this, there's people who start reading it for itself, and they start, it doesn't actually say, and then suddenly they find themselves burned at the stake, or hanged, or whatever nastiness that was common at the time. But then at the time, the Roman Church was also exercising a great deal of like very heavy-handed authority over the political authorities, and the various political leaders were having issues with that. And they themselves were chafing up, but no one wanted to challenge the authority of Rome, because they did claim divine sanction. And when you have a population that is dominantly quite superstitious, when you have some guy who who claims to be able to send you to hell, has the right to send you to hell or heaven, you would listen to them. And but they were still saying there's something not right here. Well, then you have this young hot-headed monk, has a few issues, and he likes to debate. So he writes these down, these 95 points down, and then he nails them to a door in the church in Wittenberg. Now, nailing a notice to the board or to a door in a town was just a normal way to kind of post a notice. It was like a telephone pole. But it's at a central part in town, because it's like the so he puts these up, challenging the church's authority on this, specifically, like among other things, challenging the church's assertion that one could earn one's way into heaven. And of course, with there was this process where you do good works to get into God's good graces. Now, that's a real oversimplification, but there developed a system within the Roman Catholic Church that's saying, well, if you can't do the praying, you can pay somebody else to do it for you. And that became known as an indulgence. In other words, you pay money, somebody else will do the praying for you. And Luther, and of course, the indulgences, frankly, were being used to fund the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, among other things. And they were kind of chafing at that. And Luther began to read, when he was reading the Bible himself, he said, okay, well, that's not what I'm reading here, that through grace we are saved by faith. Our faith in Jesus alone is sufficient enough for our salvation. And so he puts this up on a notice. And if Luther was in anywhere else except in where he did in Germany, he might have actually been executed as a heretic pretty quickly. But you see, the local German authorities said, he's right, and gave him. It would be 2 years before Luther himself would be declared as a heretic, but by then he had already developed a following around him that spread pretty quickly, and they were able to publish their own papers and things like that thanks to the printing press. The word got out, and the authorities, instead of turning Luther over to the Roman authorities, they began to say, no, we like them. We're going to protect this guy, and we're going to protect this idea. And that's what eventually happens in various places around Europe is that you have these protests against the Roman Church forming, and from this you have effectively what begins as the Protestant Reformation. But at the same time, the one thing that we have to make sure that we don't think of is that the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was not one single unified movement. In fact, it was actually right from the get-go, it was already a very diverse challenge to the Roman Church. It's just Luther happened to get there first, and it opened the door for other movements to sustain. And so within that, here's some roughly. Scholars disagree as to how long the Reformation actually lasted. And being the good Presbyterian that I am, I tried to stretch that out as long as possible, because the concept of reformed and reforming, it's always in process. I would venture to say we are still in the Reformation, but anyway, I don't split hairs there. But inside of this, right at this point in time, there were four major movements that within the Reformation that emerged very, very quickly. Lutheranism was the first, and that was Luther's ideas. They retained the governance model of the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, they still had bishops, archbishops, bishops, and local priests, and in that kind of hierarchy. Then you had Calvinism that was centered around Geneva in what is now Switzerland, and the reformers themselves, Calvinism and reformers. They like, if you think of it this way, Lutherans were the Protestants, Calvinists were the reformers. They sought to reform the political structure of the church because they saw too many abuses in that, and they actually sought to democratize it in that sense. And they sought to that we should be governed by wizened elders, not by individual bishops. So just to give you an idea, the term Presbyterian is from the Greek presbyteros, meaning elder. So governed by elders. And then you also had, in addition to this, you also had the Radical Reformation, which are the ones who are said, and I don't want to minimize this, but it's like, oh great, and they instead of retaining anything, they just kind of threw it all up in the air and kind of went and like they jettisoned everything. They went to believers' baptism only. They went into communities isolating themselves, and I'll get into who they are now a little later. But the Anabaptist movement are not the Baptists you think they are. Okay, people who self-identify as Baptists today are not Anabaptists, but there are plenty of Anabaptists around, and we'll get there. And then, of course, there's Anglicanism, which, of course, emerged in England in 1534. Functionally as a hybrid between Reformed ideas and Lutheran ideas, but mostly because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce. There's no finer point to put on that. I'll get to that in a second. But here's the other thing: is as the Reformation itself grew and spread, all of a sudden the Roman Catholic Church was kind of going, uh-oh, and they were losing their political power. And they were going, well, maybe there's something to that. And then they started developing, and they developed the Counter-Reformation. It's one of the reasons why some of my Roman Catholic colleagues celebrate Reformation Day, which actually happens to be a week from today, because Luther nailed those theses on October 31st, 1517, on All Hallows Eve. So they celebrate Reformation Day because if it wasn't for the Reformation, they wouldn't have the reform, a lot of the reforms that they started to experience at that point, where the church became less totalitarian, and a lot of reforms happened on there as well. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this. Each of these different movements sort of were located in different places. Of course, Lutheran was in what is now German states. Calvinism was in West Switzerland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Anglicanism, of course, England. And the Anabaptists were largely in Switzerland and South Germany. However, the Italian states, France, Ireland, Spain, all remain largely Roman Catholic. So in terms of some of that history, now the thing is, there were still Roman Catholic churches operating inside of these so-called Protestant territories as well. I mean, but of course Ireland largely remained Roman Catholic. And what ended up happening is the Reformation started, like, the Reformation wasn't unified to begin with. It was already diverse at the beginning. And so what happened is you started having this splintering into this huge array of, eventually into this huge array of denominations. I'll get to that in a second. And all of this is against the backdrop as colonialism is starting to happen, European dominance over the new world, because of the technological revolutions that happened, the Renaissance, and eventually, like, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't necessarily come later, but there was already a technological edge that the Europeans started to have, and they started exercising more and more dominance over the rest of the world, and especially the discovery of, from the European point of view, of the New World, and the eventual colonialization of the settling of those regions, particularly North and South America, but North America especially. So I want to just talk briefly about each of these movements that you'll actually recognize today as some of the different denominations that we encounter today. You have broadly Lutheranism. Of course, most accurately, the Lutherans are actually the Protestants. They were the ones who protesting against the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church. That's where the name comes from, and challenged its authority. And that gave license to, they retained the Episcopal structure. They continued to place an emphasis on on communion as the central part of worship. And as opposed to, I'll get into this down in Switzerland, we have the Reformers under John Calvin and John Knox. John Knox was a Scottish student of John Calvin, and when he went and he brought the Reformed thoughts and ideas to Scotland. So that's why the Church of Scotland is a Presbyterian system. And so thanks largely to John Calvin, and curiously enough, John Calvin wasn't Swiss, he was actually French, which is interesting because France themselves, for the most part, remain Roman Catholic. There are some French reformers in there. They're known as Huguenots, or Huguenots, I think, is how you pronounce that. But he sought to reform the governance of the church and they also placed in worship a stronger emphasis on preaching and teaching. I mean, Eucharist was still part of it, but now it was a case of listening. And ironically, as I was sort of describing to Richard earlier today, we can thank the long-winded Reformation preachers for the reason that we have pews in our churches today. Because prior to this, everybody stood in worship rather than. That's another story. I'm not going to get into detail with that tonight. The Reformers were also very, very much on the understanding of the sovereignty of God. In other words, God chooses where God acts. We have no say over where God chooses to act, and also the concept of predestination. And ironically, predestination was this idea is that a lot of the driving force behind the theological understanding of the Middle Ages is this fear of going to hell. God's going to send us to hell because we haven't done our certain prayers, or we haven't done this, or we haven't done that, but we're all going to hell. And what Calvin came up with was this concept of predestination based on his reading of Romans, especially, is that God already knows who's going. And so like what Calvin was trying to get people to do was, don't worry about that. Just live your life and leave that up to God. Trouble is people didn't quite do that. And then that evolved into something called the doctrine of double predestination, which, speaking as someone who was raised Presbyterian, I never liked anyway. I'm not going to talk about that, but the idea is that, well, if so many people are predestined for heaven, that means that so many people are predestined to hell, so God's sending us to hell anyway. But anyway, that was one of the offshoots, and a very valid criticism of it. But that's a gross oversimplification. They also developed the Presbyterian form of government, which I already mentioned, and many, in addition to Presbyterian churches, many Congregationalist churches also draw their inspiration and origins in terms of governance from here. Then we have the Radical Reformation. These are the Anabaptists, and the idea is that believers need to be, you have to make the decision of faith for yourself. In other words, they were the first ones to do only adult baptism counts. So if you were baptized as a child, that doesn't count. Therefore, we're going to baptize you again. Anabaptist means re-baptizers. Now, interestingly enough, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformers all looked at the Radical Reformation and the Anabaptists as heretics themselves, interestingly enough. But curious, the major movements from this are the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Hutterites emerge from this. So you have, of course, significant communities of Amish, Hutterite, and Amish, Mennonites, and Hutterites in North America. There are fairly large Hutterite colonies in Alberta, but they were very isolationist, and many of them, especially the Amish, do not minimally engage in technology. But the idea that the personal salvation, reflection, and a development, a focus on personal holiness, that's where it came from them. And then, of course, Anglicanism. And there's no finer way to point on this. King Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Roman Catholic Church was not going to give it to him. And because this was in approximately 1534, it was approximately about 20-ish years into the Reformation. While it was still forming, he said, well, there's other places that are breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. I'm going to do that, and did. But it was sort of this interesting, he welcomed reformers from the continent, including but they retained the internal political structure, the Episcopalian hierarchy, like so archbishops, bishops, priests, with that. And so I know Anglicans today who self-describe themselves as being Catholic but not Roman, Reformed but not Protestant. As I've said to Richard, is that there are some Anglican churches that you can walk into and you swear you're in a Roman Catholic church because of the way they worship. And on the other hand, you can come into some Anglican churches that look like, actually some of them, they look like a Pentecostal church, right from that whole charismatic thing. Now, I've not brought up Pentecostal yet because they don't even come on the scene for another 400 years. So let's keep going. But interestingly enough, the reforms that Henry VIII put in, they were quite self-serving, but those in England didn't. There was a significant movement that didn't feel that they went far enough, and that's what gave rise to the Puritans. And the Puritans, for a little while under Oliver Cromwell, actually actually took control of England for a while before restoring the monarchy, before they were effectively thrown out of power themselves and the monarchy was restored. But the Puritans also sought to eventually, because of this, they would eventually move to North America, where North America itself was this as far as they were concerned, was this wide open place where we could go just do whatever we want. We're not under the authority of anyone at the whims of any one government. Freedom of religion in the truest sense. But that made it very likely that there would be further splinters happen, small disagreements, and all of a sudden you've got different bodies and groups and splitting off. I think there was at one point, somewhere in the late 20th century, a thought something to the effect of 20,000 different denominations operating in the United States alone. So now these broad four movements also were different. There was cross-pollination happening, and they would further shape and further splinter. And of course, as I mentioned, the colonization of North America, it provided that further ground. But the Reformation itself largely came to a close sort of around 1650, and there came a time where there was actually a bit of a theological, a spiritual decline, for lack of a better term, that eventually began there were eventually a couple of movements that emerged in the 18th century. And there were these series of movements called that historians have referred to as Great Awakenings, and they show that kind of ebb and flow of religiosity in the West. And so, right now we are in an ebb, a very significant ebb, but we are in an ebb and flow. The first two of those Great Awakenings saw the rise of Methodism, and Methodism itself. And this is important to the United Church as well, because the Methodism emerged as what is called a holiness movement from within the Anglican tradition. And the idea was it was placing a focus on personal holiness and experiencing the presence of God. And in so doing, they actually started doing some practices that weren't there, including singing. Like having people sing songs together. Up to this point, the only singing permitted in churches was to sing the psalms. Like now, there were it's not to say that music wasn't a thing; it really was. But you had these elaborate masses that were largely in the department of professional musicians, whereas congregational singing, like singing together, you sang together in a bar. You didn't sing together at church, and that brought that kind of thing into the church environment of that sort of experience of that. And that personal experience of God, John Wesley, Charles Wesley, together taught. They began initially as Anglican priests, and then kind of found themselves at the beginning of a movement. And they had previously referred to them as Methodists because they were quite there was a method to their practice of spirituality, and that's how the name Methodism came out, is that they had a method to their spirituality based on reflection on Scripture, prayer, singing, and as well as doing acts in the name of one's, like good deeds in the name of one's faith. It's sometimes referred to as the Wesleyan quadrangle. And of course, thanks to Charles Wesley, all of a sudden it was not just singing psalms in worship. You had these songs. We sing a number of Chuck Wesley's stuff today, and listed in Voices United is his rules for singing, which I should really do on a Sunday morning, because they are. He wrote them with a certain degree of earnesty, but they're hilarious to read, and they're all true. I'll do that someday, but these Great Awakenings, especially the Third Great Awakening, historians argue whether or not there's been a fourth one, sort of the middle of the 20th century. But the Third Great Awakening there was sort of two large veins with it. It was centered largely in the run-up and into the aftermath of the American Civil War, largely having to do with, on one level, abolitionists, the abolition of slavery, the rise of the social gospel. In other words, we have a responsibility to our people, and the social gospel really was one of the driving forces behind the abolition of slavery, because up until this point they hadn't really there were many Christians who were slave owners, for example, and that caused great divisions in that. But there was also you had still further splinterings. Like during this time, there was something. The Millerites believed that Jesus would come back in their lifetime, and there was like someone said, "Well, as far as I can, my reading the Bible, Jesus is going to show up here on this day," and they all show up there, and of course, Jesus didn't show up, and it was a great disappointment. But from that particular one is where you get the Seventh-day Adventists and the the Millerites in this great disappointment form eventually into what we now know as the people who built the church, the church building we're in now, the Jehovah's Witnesses. It sort of emerged out of this Second Great Awakening. But the other piece that's happening during this time is a unification movement of gathering together resources, of saying, like prior to 1875, there were 4 different Presbyterian churches operating in Canada, for example, and saying, well, that's silly. Why do we have that? Well, because you had the Church of Scotland, you had the Free Presbyterian Church, you had there were four different ones. And like I said, I don't remember them all off the top of my head. But in 1875, they said, okay, well, we're all Presbyterians, let's work together. And so in 1875, the Presbyterian Church in Canada was actually founded. But that movement towards unification continued, and especially driven in Western Canada. These efforts not only started to work across, instead of keeping them themselves, they actually started working across more denominationally different lines, especially in the far-flung communities across North America. And you had these different groups where there were like a small town in I'm now moving specifically into Canada. In Western Canada, you'd have one town and 3 churches, but only 2 of the churches could actually afford to have a clergy there, or they couldn't find anybody to come. So you actually had one minister serving the Presbyterian minister serving the Methodist and the Congregationalist church in town. And they said, that's silly. We need to start working together and start pooling our resources. And so the United Church of Canada, this is a long pattern. We're finally here to the United Church of Canada. The formation of the United Church of Canada came in 1925 as a culmination of this. So the United Church of Canada is a direct product of what's referred to as the Third Great Awakening. Because the Third Great Awakening supposedly comes to a close roughly at the end of 1930. And the United Church of Canada was part of that effort. And so the idea was that we have more in common than we do differences, and that those differences could be embraced under a larger tent. And of course, the practical aspects, I've already mentioned that, where you had one minister already serving several different churches, and it just seemed to be logical to work this way. So in Western Canada, that was already starting to happen. And like even by the beginning of the 20th century, this was already in place. And so instead of having 3 churches, they said, well, why don't we just do one? And the primary ones in that conversation at this point in time were the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Congregationalist churches, which themselves were, the Methodists had largely at this point kind of reunified. The Presbyterians had unified from 4 different churches. And oddly enough, the Congregationalists, which by their very name they're very, very independent. actually there were actually Congregationalist groups that were operating together. And so the United Church of Canada was formed by an act of Parliament on June 27th, 1924. And what that act did wasn't so much like this, they left the statements of faith out of it. It wasn't about this. This was the actual legal process of bringing together all the denominations together, including all of their assets, because all of the individual churches, basically the idea is that the church itself owns everything. Like the building we are in at Trinity at Trinity here is owned by the National Church. And that's what this Act of Parliament did, is it brought everything under one legal entity at that point in time. And the denominations participating at the time were the Methodist Church Canada, and again, they had previously come together. The Congregationalists themselves were actually the Congregational Union of Ontario and Quebec, and the Association of Local Union Churches, which were basically the various Congregationalist churches already operating together on the prairies. And then my previous tribe, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, but the Presbyterians almost derailed it because the Presbyterians as a whole demanded a vote as to whether or not we should go into church union or not. Whereas the Methodists, like it was decided at the highest governance level, we're going to do this. The Congregationalists all said, "Yep, we're in," which is kind of ironic because the ones that actually behaved like Congregationalists were the Presbyterians. And depending on who you asked and how you asked the questions, it's either 2/3 of the Presbyterian Church in Canada or 94% of the Presbyterian Church in Canada went into church union. And just to give you an idea of it, it was about 2/3 of the membership of the Presbyterian Church in Canada came into church union, but it was 94% of the actual congregations that went. And this is why we have two St. Andrews in Nanaimo. We have St. Andrew's United Church, which was founded in 1893 as a Presbyterian church. And then we have St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church that's in a different building, made up of the members of St. Andrew's, what became St. Andrew's United Church, that weren't happy about it and physically got up, walked out of the pews, and set up their own church elsewhere. Being the continuing Presbyterians, and I was ordained into that tribe, so I can make fun of them as much as I like. But what it ended up being, it was something to the effect of 90% of the clergy, but only about 2/3 of the membership, and most of those assets, and they became the remaining Presbyterians retained the name of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And there was some legal disputes around that, but they managed to do that. Ironically, now the Anglican Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and the United Church of Canada are all moving into the same office space in Toronto sometime within the next year. So we're cooperating anyway, I guess. And that's how it came to be. Now, the United Church of Canada didn't just go united and then stay that way. They actually, over time, would invite other churches to negotiate with other churches to join, because that was their idea. There's a similar movement in Australia that Sue was part of, called the Uniting Church of Australia. And the United Church of Canada, the idea is that it would still be open to that. That the Evangelical Brethren Church would join, or the Evangelical United Brethren Church would join the United Church of Canada in 1968. Curiously enough, they were an adult believers baptism church, and that was one thing they gave up when they came into church union. North of Calgary, there's a small church that was an Evangelical United Brethren Church in in about that and if you look carefully in that old building, there was a baptismal font underneath the chancel. But that's another part. Now, another interesting point is in the late 60s, early 70s, there was also a movement to have the United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada join. It didn't happen, but as part of that effort, some of you might remember the red hymn book that came before Voices United, that had that kind of the shape of the cross made out of music staves on the front. I think we still have some copies at the church. I don't think I've got a copy that sitting here anywhere. No, I don't. But sometimes you may have grown up with something called the Red Book, or you might refer to that. The Anglicans also used that book from 1971, when it was published, till both Voices United and Common Praise, the Anglicans version of it, came out in the mid-90s. And that collective hymn book was an early part of that effort of church union with the Anglicans. Now, that ultimately did not happen. And I'm not, if it ever will, I don't know. But I mean, that was a conversation that was happening in the late 60s, early 70s. But that comes, and I had planned to go pretty much to 8:30. So that's the whirlwind church history and where the United Church, like it's that following line, and here's where we fit. But the idea behind this was to kind of set things in context, that we are part of the larger, wider church, and there you can actually draw a fairly direct, if winding thread, throughout church history to see where we are connected with that. And so the so part of that is just being able to say, we are, we have that connected history, and that's in essence answers the question, well, where did we come from? And some will ask the question, well, is the United Church Christian? And it's kind of like, well, yes, we are still, the part of our tradition affirms the Nicene Creed, for example. Now, granted, we tend to use a newer ecumenical creed called, sometimes referred to as a new creed, but it doesn't displace the old. It doesn't displace the previous one. And that just shows it there. Anyway, so that's my presentation for tonight. But I'm wide open for questions. I know that Richard, you wanted me to go over this particular symbol, and I will go over it next week, because that's in the question of what do we believe, and this symbol is very much part of that.
Well, it was just part of the conversation I was having with Betty. So it was that part of, at a point, she wasn't 100% sure. So between the two of us, we were trying to go, okay, how is this going to work? And that's what brought this whole conversation up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm certainly happy to talk about this. And you will notice that if you compare this symbol, which is the current official logo of the United Church of Canada, it is actually different than the one that's currently hanging in the Sanctuary of Trinity. The one that's hanging in the Sanctuary of Trinity is the old one.
That was a trick. Wow.
Yep. It looks very similar, but there's one, well, there's actually two very significant differences between them. So,
as I said, when Foster actually briefly talked about it because of the kids, I found it odd that at a certain point I thought, okay, I think I sort of got this.
Yep.
And then someone started talking to me, and I think it was Kerry that came up with, I wasn't sure whether it was the burning bush or had something to do with the book. And I remember thinking, oh man, I was going to take her aside and go, could you re-explain that to me? But I thought, no. Yeah. Okay.
No, I am happy to do that as a formal part of next week because like written.
Okay.
But at this point, are there any other questions? I mean, this is largely the broad historical. I mean, like honestly, any one of those slides that we did tonight, frankly, that's a PhD thesis in and of itself. I mean, I could do an entire seminar. Like I did a whole series on the Crusades, for example, back at St. Matthew's, of talking about what the Crusades were, how and how they evolved and everything else. But because we're talking about the United Church of Church of Canada, yeah, to be able to work with that. So, but so any questions?
I did not think you were going to be able to do it from Jesus Christ to present day in this amount of time. So well done.
Well, I felt like I was moving pretty quickly. So if you're kind of feeling I did record it, so you can slow it down. But what I wanted to do was just draw that connection to say, here is the link that we are connected to the wider Christian church in this.
Something we say chat, do we?
Actually, Doug, I can hear you. So
I found it very interesting, John.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, are there any questions? Like I said, if there's any questions you want to cover, because like being from my perspective as a historian, that's kind of what I wouldn't say it's my strong point, but it's certainly one I'm very comfortable with. Whereas next week, for example, we're going to start talking about what do we believe, there are all kinds of jokes, and I'm going to share some of those jokes with you about that. But at the same time, it's the diversity. The United Church, one of the United Church's strengths is its diversity, and so I will be getting into that because it's not a big melting pot. There's a lot of room within it as well. And if you want the link to Ralph Milton's book, by all means, like it is still probably 80-90% still valid in terms of the church's ethos and understanding of itself. It's when it gets into the actual nuts and bolts of the governance where where things have changed. But that's more for session 3 anyway. So
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you for coming. And again, if you think of any questions during the week, just email me, and I'm glad to offer it. So
Okay.
thank you all very much. I'm just going to stop the recording now. Where's this?
Yeah.
So stop the share and my recording. Somehow I've lost where there we are.